So indeed, on the list of the 100 must-read papers that we published, there are 98 of them which are first authored by men authors, and that is indeed a bit striking and probably problematic. The reason why there are so many men in this list is mostly because it's a list that is on average 40 years old. The papers are 40 years old on average because they are classical papers. So it's a list that has been proposed collectively by a pool of editors. I asked 665 different editors in ecology to give me a recommended list of papers. And on average, they are 40 years old because they are classical papers. And 40 years ago, they were mostly male scientists, many more than female scientists, which explain this huge bias. If you look at the earlier papers in the list, in the overall list, which is 550 long, then there are more women authors on the more recent times. The problem is seen as a highlight of the lack of women in science, which I agree it is, although I think it is not the fault of the list, neither of the editors, because indeed there were more male in the editors than there were women. But if we take into account only the votes of the women, then instead of having a list with 98 of them first authored by a man, it is 96, so only 2 fewer. So it is not because people would judge papers according to gender and they would select more often men authoring papers, but it is because the classical papers, which were a bit older, were mostly written by men because they were mostly men 40, 50 years ago. Oh yes, I think if maybe to a lesser extent, because invasion biology is a more recent discipline. So the classical papers would be younger, less old, and so the gender bias would be less. But the gender bias is still currently important. On average, it's about, let's say, 22% now that are, of the papers in ecology that are first authored by women. So I would expect something on this figure, but we would not have something like 50-50, because otherwise it would just mean it's not a general list of scientifically important paper. It's a list that is based on an ideological stance to try to balance by gender. And although it's important to take into account gender, we also need to take into account ethnicity, religion, geographic provenance, and many other things that are also important as much as gender.